Hello, I would like to greet the Philippine Association for the Study of Culture, History, and Religion on this occasion of their inaugural national conference. I'd especially like to thank Dr. Grace Odal Devora and Dr. B.J. Sebastian for inviting me to this conference and for helping me to get ready and get my papers in on time. I'll be presenting a paper on the sandalwood trade from medieval times up until the modern colonial period. Thank you. Few trade items were as valuable throughout human history as yellow sandalwood, also called white sandalwood. In particular, the fragrant wood was an important ingredient in the production of sacred and medicinal incense and ointments. Some scholars even believe that the almug wood, mentioned in the Old Testament as a building material for King Solomon's temple, was either yellow sandalwood or red sandalwood. Kingdoms in Luzon, Mindanao, Sulu, and Butuan, in what is now known as the Philippines, played an important role in the old sandalwood trade, going back at least until the Yuan dynasty, up until colonial times. In those days, yellow sandalwood came mostly from the island of Timor, until the product nearly became extinct there due to excessive logging. The Philippine archipelago sat along the important shipping lanes known to the Chinese as the Eastern Ship Route, which was the main conduit for sandalwood, cloves, nutmeg, mace, cinnamon, and other products from the southern Philippines and eastern Indonesia. Although sandalwood today comes largely from India, numerous sources suggest that in early times most sandalwood came from Timor. Tome Perez, for example, stated, "God made Timor for sandalwood, and Banda for mace, and the Moluccas for cloves, and that this merchandise is not known anywhere else in the world except in these places, and that he asked and inquired very diligently whether they had this merchandise anywhere else in the world, and they said not." Chinese sources generally agree that sandalwood was primarily a product of Timor. The Western Ship Route involves sailing along the mainland Southeast Asian coastline from Xuanzhou in Fujian through Vietnam and Cambodia, from which ships continued to sail southwest to Malaya, Sumatra, and Java. Not as well known is the Eastern Ship Route that followed the trade winds due south from Xuanzhou and stayed east of the Vietnam Sea. The necessity of staying east of the Vietnam Sea along the Eastern Ship Route was due to the existence of many shoals and coral reefs in this area. We know that these low-lying or submerged islands, we know them as the Paracel and the Spratly Islands today. Historian Roderick Patak explains these two routes in more detail. He says in his work, "Elsewhere I have demonstrated that this east-west segmentation can be related to the existence of two major trade arteries between China to Southeast Asia, the so-called Western Route and the Eastern Route. Ships sailing from the first route went from Fujian and Guangdong to Hainan and Vietnam, passing the Paracel Islands on the western side. From Vietnam they proceeded to the Malayan east coast and finally around the peninsula's southern tip to Malacca and the Indian Ocean. A further link connected the southern tip to Vietnam to Cape Datu, from where these vessels would follow the Kalimantan coast down towards Java. Now the second route ran from Fujian via the southern tip of Taiwan to Luzon. From Luzon one would then go through the Sulu Sea to Brunei, or via the Sulu Islands and the Celebes Sea to Sulawesi, Maluku, Seram, Timor, and so forth. The existence of this double route system is related to a very special geographical feature. The central part of the South China Sea was considered dangerous due to its many shoals and reefs. The Zhu Fan Ji describes the shallow blue water of the area, a result of the coral habitat where the sky and the water meet with the same color. The author of this work goes on further to say that ships and boats sailing through the area are solely dependent on the compass to guide their navigation. Days and nights, the compass has to be carefully observed, because even the slightest error may make a difference between life and death. This dangerous situation is common knowledge among mariners in this region up to today. The many low-lying islands and shoals and the low tide elevations make the Paracel and Spratly Islands a hazardous area for shipping, especially for boats with deep keels. Modern navigational charts, for example, mark the entire Spratly region as dangerous ground. Patak notes that the eastern ship route extends through the area of the modern Philippines, southward to Maluku and Timor. Maluku and the surrounding area was the main center for the production of clove flower buds, nutmeg, and mace. Timor, again, was the primary source of sandalwood during the medieval and early colonial periods. Patak believes that Butuan, along with Champa, were the main re-exporters of cloves during the Song dynasty. During the Yuan dynasty, Mindolang, a polity mentioned along with Sulu and Butuan, may refer to Mindanao or Mindoro in the Philippines. Accounts from the time claim that sandalwood was one of the natural products of the island. However, it may be that Mindanao during this period actually acted as an entrepot for this trade item. Archaeological evidence suggests that the idea of extensive Philippine trade with China and other Southeast Asian nations goes back at least to the 11th century. Kenneth R. Hall mentions that layers of ceramic deposits that provide evidence of these trade networks at ports is available at ports around the Philippines. Each of these communities, Hall notes, have trade links with China that are demonstrated by the community's association with significant deposits of Song and Ming porcelain dating to the 13th and 14th centuries. The archaeological remains of early Laguna, Mindoro, and Cebu societies especially document the rapid growth of trade centers as people from the interior and other islands congregated around ports fortified with brass artillery to protect against the piracy rampant in the region's sea channels. And this was in response to the opportunities and demands afforded by foreign trade. Additional evidence of maritime trade comes from the Pandanan and Lina Shoal shipwrecks off Palawan and the Santa Cruz wreck off Zambales that date from the 14th and 15th centuries. Unfortunately, the main items found in archaeological expeditions consist of ceramic and metallic objects, as organic materials like sandalwood and spices quickly decompose under most conditions. When Martin de Goiti arrived in Manila in 1570, he found 40 Chinese and 20 Japanese families living in the city along with 4 trading junks in the harbor. These connections were profound and probably had a significant impact on the future direction of trade between Asian and European nations that started in the 16th century. Paris, for example, mentions that neither Javans nor Malays were allowed at the port of Guangzhou, according to an account he had heard from Luzons who had been there. The report suggests that the Luzons were trading in South China, or at least in Guangzhou, to the exclusion of 2 of the most important trading groups of insular Southeast Asia during that time. The evidence provided by Portuguese writers suggests that the Luzons may have monopolized the trade between Malacca and China. Miguel Lopez de Legazpi reported in the late 16th century that merchants from Luzon and Brunei were frequently mistaken for Chinese, and that people in Maluku considered their ships to be Chinese junks, quote unquote, because they carried Chinese goods. Such reports indicate that the Luzons, together with their allies from Brunei, acted as middlemen for the trade between China and Southeast Asia. The Ming bans on Chinese external trade continued, combined with the close relationships forged in earlier periods, may have helped the Luzons secure this position. Both Legazpi and Villalobos report Chinese junks in Butuan, and it is noteworthy that the expeditions of Magellan and Villalobos sailed to the Moluccas, to Maluku, Ambon, and Timor via the southern Philippines. International relations, including royal intermarriages, may have helped cement ties between Luzons and others in the Philippines, with people throughout the Southeast Asia region. Pigafetta, for example, mentions that a Prince of Luzon acted as an admiral for the King of Brunei. Raja Soliman of Manila's son had married the daughter of the Sultan of Brunei, and many relatives of Rajas Lakandula, Soliman, and Matanda fled to Brunei along with their entourages after the Spanish invasion of Luzon. Humabon and the King of Cebu during Magellan's visit was fluent in either Malay, Cham, or Thai, which he used to speak with a merchant from either Champa or Siam, Thailand, that is. And also we know that the Luzon spice trader, Regimo de Raja, based in Malacca, was highly influential, and that the Portuguese had appointed him as the sea lord, or the governor, basically, of the Muslims of Malacca. His father and wife carried on his maritime trading business after he had died. Another important Malacca trader was Surya de Raja, who also hailed from Luzon. The surname of de Raja is actually may indicate that both Regimo and Surya came from noble or royal families, because the name is an abbreviation of Sanskrit Adiraja, which means basically someone of royal or noble descent. We can surmise from the available information that these relationships, some of which may have been cultivated for centuries, helped Manila later on during the colonial period in becoming the epicenter of global galleon trade. By 1589, nearly half of the South Seas trading licenses had Manila as their destination. By 1603, there were about 20,000 Chinese residing in Manila alone, while in comparison there were only 400 Chinese in Batavia in 1619 and 400 in Malacca in 1649. In addition to the royal marital ties with regional nations, there is also evidence of the possibility of other types of political relationships. Portuguese and other writers frequently mention Luzon serving in the navies or armies of foreign kingdoms. While many modern commentators label these Luzons as mercenaries, suggesting that they were basically soldiers for hire, this may not be the correct judgment in all cases. For example, the Prince of Luzon's command of the Brunei fleet surely was not connected to any type of mercenary activity. The political family relationships between nations in the region may have fostered the deployment of Luzon soldiers and sailors to other countries in fulfillment of alliances and treaties. A Luzon named Sepetu Daraja, for example, was commander of king of Sumatra's garrison on the Aru archipelago in Maluku. Even during the colonial period, the people of Luzon and other parts of the Philippines were essential in allowing the Spanish to maintain the Manila galleon trade for 250 years. A number of researchers have suggested that the Indios played the major role in making the galleon enterprise successful. In a sense, it may be the role played by the Luzons in earlier centuries prepared them for the demands of the world's first global trade system. Historians like Dennis O. Flynn, Arturo Giraldez, and Andrew Peterson contend that the indigenous Filipinos provided the raw materials, the galleon building labor, the mariners and soldiers, and even the financing required to maintain the seagoing enterprise of the Manila galleon trade. According to one report, for a galleon that costs 60,000 pesos to the king's treasury, the people of Pampanga would pay 150,000 pesos. Now, Pampanga supplied the wood and most of the rice and other food supplies needed to feed the workers, soldiers, and seafarers involved in the galleon trade. The compulsory Vandala system required that the people of Pampanga and other parts of the Philippines sell goods to the government, that the latter would often be late in paying. They were often late in repaying their debts. Because of the fertility of the region, Pampangans had to pay tribute in rice, while other provinces could substitute cash for rice. The situation became so bad that a revolt broke out in Pampanga, led by Francisco Maniago, forcing the Spanish governor to come to terms with the people of Pampanga. The Manila trade demonstrated that the people of Luzon were capable of undertaking daring maritime ventures that most seafarers from other nations at that time were not willing to accept because it was a very difficult journey across the Pacific. One can easily see how the intense trading activity of the Luzons during the Ming and other earlier periods helped prepare the people for the Manila galleon trade. Archaeological data suggests a surge in trade during the late Ming period as a result of the open door policy of that dynasty. During the late phase of that dynasty in the 15th and 16th centuries, there was a dramatic rise in the quantity of ceramics at Philippine trade ports, sometimes reaching magnitudes of tenfold over earlier periods. This evidence clearly shows that the upswing in trading activity predates the Spanish colonization, and the quality of the imports ranged from the highest grades for elite clients to poorly crafted items probably meant for the average consumer. What we know from European and Chinese accounts of the time indicate that there were three important routes used by the Luzon traders. One that extended to Brunei through the Palawan Strait and onward to Malacca, and one that went southward toward Maluku and as far south as Timor. And the other one went north from Luzon to the ports of South China. In this setup, it appears that Chinese traders, particularly during certain periods, traded mainly at Luzon and at other Philippine ports like Butuan, while relying on Luzon middlemen to handle trade with other countries. Since much of the sandalwood from timber headed to Chinese markets, we can surmise that Luzon traders would have managed much of this trade, if they did not indeed monopolize the trade. Sandalwood may have come to Chinese ports either directly through the eastern ship route, or the products may have come may have been re-exported through Malacca, but again coming to China aboard ships of the Lusois. Now, Ujimo de Raja had dispatched trade ships to China, Brunei, Siam, Java, and Sumatra. His father sent trading ships to China, and his widow sent at least one junk to Sunda in Indonesia. Now, Surya de Raja sent one trading ship annually to Luzon. He also sent a yearly junk to China with about 200 metric tons of pepper for trade. Surya owned a plantation, and one of his junks was among those that accompanied the first Portuguese maritime mission to China in 1513. Indeed, the Portuguese appeared to employ Luzons, the Lusois, to help them navigate in the area, as one Portuguese commentator describes the Lusois as discoverers and as good pilots. Logically, given the statement by Pigafetta that Luzon traders were dealing in sandalwood at Timor, the fragrant product would have been one of the items brought to Malacca and directly to China during their trading missions. When the Spanish established the Manila galleon trade, we know that that sandalwood was one of the items found on ships coming from China. The Portuguese, who were in charge of the sandalwood trade at the time from Timor, carried these items to Macau from the island of Timor to trade with the Chinese. And the Chinese would often re-export this product, taking sandalwood to Japan, Korea, and even the Philippines. During the union of Spain and Portugal under Philip II, the trade between Manila and Macau was quite brisk. Now, after the dissolution of that union, the trade fell into disrepair until the Portuguese again decided to resurrect it in 1672 to take advantage of the Habsburg Treaty. Interestingly enough, at that time, the Captain General on Timor, the main source of sandalwood, was a person of Kapampangan descent, known as Matthias da Costa. Now, this da Costa traced his descent from the Kapampangans, who served with the Spanish in Maluku during the 17th century. During that time, the Spanish had invaded those islands and ruled them for a period of time. Da Costa's forebears eventually moved to Larantuka, which may have harbored a sizable Kapampangan population, made up mostly of people of Maharlika descent, known as the Topazes. Da Costa himself became a Topaz lord, and his descendants intermarried with another important clan on Timor, the De Hornais, to form the hereditary lineage that ruled Timor during much of the colonial sandalwood trade. Da Costa was one of the group of people known as Black Portuguese. He was a person of Kapampangan descent who likely spoke Portuguese. Now, we don't have any information as to whether he had any connections with his ancient homeland of Pampanga in Luzon. What we do know is that the mixed race people of Timor, these Black Portuguese, managed to hold off the Dutch and the Portuguese crowns, despite claiming allegiance to the latter, to the Portuguese crown. They effectively controlled the sandalwood trade from the middle of the 17th century until late in the 19th century. Although they only controlled the whole island of Timor for about a century, they had a powerful influence among the Timorese royal, noble, and aristocratic families that allowed them to foil the Portuguese and Dutch designs on the sandalwood trade, and that for most of that time they controlled about half of the island, The resistance against the colonial powers continued in the interior of Timor until about the early 20th century, in fact. Excessive exploitation of sandalwood trees on Timor, however, led to their near extinction by the early 19th century. As sandalwood stocks on Timor dwindled, European explorers sailing mostly out of Manila discovered a new source of the product in Melanesia and Polynesia in the late 18th century. Before long, mostly British and American companies were shipping sandalwood from the Pacific Islands to trade in Manila and Canton for tea, silk, and other products. Eventually, sandalwood in the Pacific region also declined markedly due to overexploitation. White and yellow sandalwood dropped out of view from the trade scene in the Philippines, although the widely used word for sandalwood, i.e. sandana, still occurs in the languages of Pampanga and the Visayas, where it refers to a fragrant wood and not specifically to the white sandalwood tree, Santalum album. The Philippines also has a form of red sandalwood tree, the Nara tree, which is known as the Apalit tree in Pampanga, that may have taken place of the white sandalwood tree. Like the latter, the wood of the Nara tree is highly valued for religious carvings. I would like to conclude in saying that the evidence suggests that from the Song dynasty up until colonial times, the evidence points to the eastern ship route being an important conduit for goods from eastern Indonesia northward to China and to other destinations. Now, China and other nations would often re-export the sandalwood and the other products to other countries. The evidence suggests that polities in what is now known as the Philippines played an important role as entrepôts for sandalwood and other goods along the eastern ship route from medieval times up until the early colonial period,